There has been much talk in the media of late concerning President Trump's raising the idea of auditing Fort Knox in Kentucky, one of the main storage sites in the US for its gold reserves. Pundits have suggested that the last time Fort Knox was audited was in the early 1950s, with a partial audit 50 years ago in 1974. The question everyone keeps asking is whether or not the vast tonnage of gold bullion is still in Fort Knox. If the gold is there, a huge proportion of it was originally British, and its presence in America stems from the dark days of 1940 to 41, when Britain was in serious danger of being defeated by Nazi Germany. How all of Britain's gold reserves ended up being owned by the United States is not widely discussed in the history of World War II, and certainly in the history of relations between Britain and America. But the decisions taken between 1939 and 41 had far-reaching consequences not only for Britain, but also for the balance of world power, and still colours Britain's relationship with the US today. War is cripplingly expensive for nations. Once Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, following years of unsuccessful diplomatic efforts to contain Hitler's territorial ambitions in Europe, the financial cost of fighting Nazi Germany quickly precipitated a financial catastrophe. In 1939, Britain was acknowledged as the foremost military power in the world, based primarily on its huge 1,400-ship navy and its vast territorial empire that encompassed a quarter of the world's surface. The US wasn't far behind regarding its own navy, and its economic power had already overtaken Britain by the time of the First World War, meaning that America, though officially isolationist in the 1930s under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was challenging Britain's place in the world. To be fair, the US was Britain's competitor, and though friendly to its close cultural and linguistic ally, the US naturally pursued policies that benefited America. Once the German invasion of France and the Lowe Countries commenced in May 1940, it quickly became apparent that France was going to be defeated. And Britain also changed prime ministers during that critical period, from Neville Chamberlain, who had taken Britain into war with Germany over Poland, and Winston Churchill, a maverick politician whose stance was victory over Germany at all costs. And it was those costs that caused Britain to ask for American help. A year earlier, Britain had begun taking financial precautions by sending some of its gold from the Bank of England to Canada, which was of course part of the British Empire. In May 1939, 50 tons of gold were shipped to Ottawa aboard 2 cruisers, HMS Southampton and Glasgow. In September 1939, when the war broke out, a convoy was sent to Canada consisting of 5 ships, led by the cruiser HMS Emerald, each vessel carrying huge sums of gold bullion, followed by a second convoy in November. Britain was trying to buy supplies, weapons, and other materials to keep in the war, and the Americans were fairly tough. They would only accept gold bullion and negotiable securities. This system was called cash and carry. The US attitude was understandable due to Britain's behaviour after the First World War. That war had also been ruinously expensive for Britain, which had resorted to borrowing heavily from the United States. In 1934, the British government had defaulted on its World War I loans to the US, leaving unpaid debts exceeding $4 billion. When Britain returned to the US in 1940 asking for financial assistance, the Treasury Department remembered this and insisted not on loans, but direct payment, hence cash and carry. The US was also governed by the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, which meant that this stuff had to be paid for by cash. So how much was the war costing Britain in 1940 to 41? Historians have estimated that in 1941, the war was costing Britain $48 million per day at 1941 prices. That's the equivalent today to over $1 billion. Put another way, following Britain's defeat in France and the evacuation from Dunkirk, the cost of the war was calculated as 60% of national income, much of it raised by severe taxation of British citizens. Privately owned gold and securities were also ordered to be surrendered to the government to help pay for the ruinous costs of continuing to fight the Germans. You have to remember that by June 1940, the pre-war professional army, or what was left of it, returned from France minus almost all of its weapons, vehicles, artillery, guns, and equipment. It has been estimated by historians that Britain lost the equivalent in material terms of 10 fully equipped divisions in France and Belgium, and the shattered army was being hastily rebuilt with a huge influx of volunteers and conscripts for which there were insufficient weapons and uniforms, preparatory for what many thought was going to be a German invasion of Britain itself. But according to Churchill, the most alarming aspect of all of this was the U-boat war, which was sinking Allied merchant ships at a staggeringly alarming rate, and threatened to bring Britain to the negotiating table if her access to raw materials, weapons, food, and also access to the other parts of the British Empire was successfully severed. By June 1940, Churchill realistically had two stark choices. Either seek a negotiated settlement with Hitler to end the war, while Britain still retained most of its national wealth and the British Empire was largely intact, or option 2, go cap in hand to the Americans to try and obtain the necessary materials, weapons, etc. to keep fighting on in the hope of someday turning the tide against Nazi Germany. Churchill chose option 2. So he enacted Operation Fish in June 1940, the stripping of the gold and securities from the Bank of England's vaults and its transshipment to Canada, thence on to Fort Knox, as payment as part of the cash and carry scheme for her continued support. HMS Revenge, a battleship, accompanied by 2 converted ocean liners, shipped at 1940 prices £60 million in gold bullion, arriving safely in Halifax, Nova Scotia in early June. The big operation commenced on the 24th of June, when HMS Emerald once again crossed the Atlantic, packed with £30 million in bullion and £200 million in negotiable securities, again at 1940 prices, arriving at Halifax on the 1st of July. This treasure was then sent by heavily guarded train, the gold to Ottawa and the securities to Montreal. A week later, another convoy left the UK for Halifax, led by Revenge, consisting of the cruiser HMS Bonaventure and the passenger liners Monarch of Bermuda, Sobieski, and Batory. They carried between them, at 1940 prices, £450 million, including gold bullion worth £192 million, or at today's values somewhere in the region of £50 billion. More shipments were made to continue to finance cash and carry, whilst we still had any gold and valuables left. Though it is not often discussed, much of this gold ended up at Fort Knox. The World Gold Council figures on this are emphatic. In 1938, the US had about 9,000 tons of gold in reserve. By 1942, that figure was almost 20,000 tons. The 11,000-ton difference was largely made up from the transfer of British gold reserves, including those held in South Africa. Looking at the available figures, it's easy to see how much of Britain's gold reserves was swallowed up by cash and carry. In 1938, Britain's gold reserves were about £800 million in 1938 prices, but in 1939 alone, £300 million was spent on cash and carry. More, of course, went in 1940 and 1941. Unfortunately, the transfer of all the British gold to the US, along with the securities, did not pay for the entire cost of the war. By 1941, Britain was effectively bankrupt, something you don't hear often said, but true, and the US Treasury knew it. In fact, it conducted an audit of Britain's assets, or those that could be turned into cash, and those suspicious of the British. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. reported to President Roosevelt that, quote, "They have no dollar assets beyond those they have disclosed to me. Lacking a formula by which Great Britain can continue to buy supplies here, I think they will just have to stop fighting, that's all." End quote. Of course, the United States didn't want Britain to stop fighting. The US now created something called Lend-Lease, allowing Britain to purchase supplies, but at interest, this debt to be settled after the war. Lend-Lease allowed Britain to continue to fight, but at a huge cost to the country and its place in the world. Britain received $32 billion through Lend-Lease. At 2025 values, that is $561 billion, a debt amounting to 1/3 of its GDP. It would mean that Britain was in debt to the United States, changing forever its relationship with that nation. How could it not do otherwise? This time, a bankrupt and exhausted Britain, minus its gold reserves, would not be permitted to renege on its debts to America as it had done in 1934. The British finally paid off its World War II Lend-Lease debts to the United States in 2006. So, 80 years after World War II ended, when they look inside the vaults at Fort Knox, I guarantee that thousands of those gold bars will still carry the stamp of the Bank of England, a direct link to Operation Fish and the beginning of a post-1945 New World Order. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.